Okay, I think we can get started. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Social Ministry Committee of St. Anne and Our Lady of Lourdes Church, I want to welcome you to tonight's talk, our second in our rescheduled, originally Lenten soup supper. I feel like it's still Lent. It must still be March. But I want to thank you all for coming. My name is John Capusta, and I'm going to be serving as our Zoom host for the evening. So if you have any issues during the talk, you can send me a message. I set the chat function so that you can only contact me. So don't worry, you won't be accidentally sending your message to everyone. I've disabled that. So if perhaps you're all by now familiar with Zoom, but just so you know, if you look towards the bottom of your window and in the middle, you'll see, and you can click there at any time and send me a message, including if you'd like to ask a question. Last time we tried a format where in the question and answer session, I solicited questions from our audience to be written and sent to me via chat so that I could moderate. And no one was brave enough to send a text or written question, but some people were willing to pipe up after I invited general questions. So I'll just say at the beginning that if you'd like to ask a question and you'd like me to ask it, feel free to send me a message, or if you'd like to ask a question but you don't want to say what your question is at the moment, just let me know. But at the end of the presentation, there'll also be a chance for you to just speak up. So again, if you have any questions, just send me a message. And without further ado, I will ask Father Gary Timon to welcome our speaker.
Thank you, John, and thank you for hosting, being the most technical savvy person to host our Zoom meetings. John teaches at the Eastman School of Music and has become skilled at Zoom by teaching classes that way.
Quite against my will.
So it is my privilege and pleasure to introduce Sister Christine Wagner. She is a sister of St. Joseph here in Rochester, a native of Rochester, who attended Nazareth Academy and SUNY Brockport. She did graduate work in conflict resolution at Syracuse University. And since 1993, she has been the executive director of St. Joseph's Neighborhood Center, a not-for-profit that serves the health care and mental health needs of those in the Rochester area who do not have access to appropriate care. And if any of you have been, and I'm sure some of you have been to visit the Neighborhood Center, you know the amazing work that they do, and the volunteers, the medical volunteers who come and provide service for those who are uninsured and underinsured. And there is a rumor going around in our social ministry committee that Sister is also an excellent cook and serves mighty breakfasts. So that might be another reason to drop by the Neighborhood Center. Since 2015, Chris has been involved in work around the issues of racial equity. And that 5 years ago is when the Neighborhood Center initiated a community-wide exploration of institutional and structural racism in the Rochester area. And so it is particularly, with both backgrounds, because in the Neighborhood Center and working with that clientele over time, there's experiences there, and then with the wider examination and discussion of racism in our community. Chris has a great deal of insight to share with us. and we're particularly hopeful in terms of what are things that we can be working on in the future. So, Chris, thank you very much for, we canceled you in March, and thank you for coming back in October.
Sister, I think you're muted.
You have to unmute yourself, sister.
Unmute myself. Well,
There you go.
So much for the technician, really.
Strangely, I can't unmute you. You have to do it yourself.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Gary. That was a very nice introduction. I see faces I know, and that's always wonderful. And then new faces to me, and that's wonderful too. When Gary said that I have, my graduate work was in conflict resolution, and people say to me, well, do you have any background in healthcare? How can you be running a healthcare center if you don't have any background? And I say to them, first of all, there's a lot of conflict in healthcare. So those particular skill sets really, they come in handy. And as you'll probably surmise later, what we have come to discover is that health is a racial issue. So those two things kind of go together. What are we doing? What are we doing in the racial equity space? So just let me say, I'm really, really glad to be with you tonight. Yeah, it was a long time ago. John, called about Lent in March. And then, oh my God, something happened to all of us, COVID and many other things. But we're all picking up and doing what we need to do. Now, of course, for all of us, face-to-face meetings are the best and most conducive to conversations and the development of understanding among us. I really pray that when we do get to see each other again, face-to-face in the same space, that we remembered how much we missed each other. And that when we do get together again, we bring the great deal of love and respect, into our gathering spaces, reflecting on how much we miss each other when we can't see each other. So, but I was thinking, on the other hand, by the power vested in us by Zoom, we can be together and actually have more access to information than we might have had otherwise. So I kind of think we have the good and then we have the somewhat compromised, and we need to take advantage of all of those things. So I've been invited to speak to you tonight about the Rochester community, the current work on race, efforts to achieve racial equity, and look at the barriers we face to that goal. I'm in the middle of a sandwich with the other two presenters who, as people of color, can speak with unquestioned authenticity about what it is like to be Black in our community. So having said that, I need to set for you some context for me being here and doing this presentation. I speak to you as a white middle-class woman. I'm a member of a congregation of white women religious, the Sisters of St. Joseph of Rochester. I have a graduate degree. I have privileges in our society that others do not have and that I did not earn. And for most of my life, I have been oblivious to them and have taken them for granted. It wasn't until a few years ago, I even asked myself the question, when did I realize I was white? And the truth is, I don't know. When did I start to explore what my whiteness means in our society? And that's really only a few years ago, to do some serious questioning. when did I realize that as a white person, I have privilege? Again, unfortunately, only a few years ago. I am a sister with a PhD and white, and those things give me passage in society that even some in this virtual room don't have. I can go in someplace and say, I'm Sister Chris, and you'd think I was on some kind of pedestal. And I try to say to people, oh, please, I'm just like you. There's nothing special about this. I can call a doctor's office and say, this is Dr. Wagner. And the receptionist doesn't ask me what kind of doctor I am. They just put me right through. And sometimes I've used that to the advantage of our patients and clients because we need to get through. So it's like, I got some privilege here. I'm going to use it. I'm going to use this. So, you know, it's the privilege is there, and I've become more and more aware of it. I do not get followed in stores. I do not get pulled over in my car because of my color. I would not be denied an apartment, a loan, a mortgage, or a credit card because of my color. So what actually then makes me qualified to speak to you about anti-racism work in Rochester? It's a good question. There is an opening quote in a book that I read by Sue Monk Kidd several years ago that says, once you wake up, can you wake up anymore? Once you wake up, can you wake up anymore? Have any of you ever had the experience, I bet all of you have, of for your whole life reading or hearing a gospel passage, and one day you read it and hear it again and you go, oh my God, I never thought of it that way. And we could, you know, read it again and we get a new insight. So my answer is, yeah, you can wake up again. I've been blessed in the last few years of my life to become friends and colleagues with people who have invited me to interrogate my own whiteness, to interrogate my own privilege attached to being white, and the disparities that exist for people of color in the areas of education and healthcare, the justice system, employment, the achievement of wealth, just to name a few areas of our social selves. I really thank God for these people every day. They're both people of color and people who are white. They have been gentle with me and my unconsciousness, and they have roused me again and again and again into a new level of awareness. So the answer for me is yes. Once you wake up, you can wake up time and time and time again. But I need to, and I think we all have to be purposeful about it. I commend you actually on taking the purposeful step of attending these gatherings and listening to people's experience, to people's questions, to people's pain that have been a part of their life. That listening and becoming more and more conscious and more awake is it's really a wonderful first step in understanding this whole issue of racism. So with that context, let me tell you a little bit about work for racial equity that's happening in our community now. As you well know, racism has existed in our country for 400 years, for as long as slavery and its aftermath have existed here in the United States. And there has been slavery in different places all over the world. We have a an ugly history of 400 years in this country, but slavery is not unknown since biblical times. But we're talking right now about our own context. Those who are old enough, and if you would forgive me, I'm going to say I'm looking at these pictures, that would be like everybody. Those who are old enough to have memories of 1964 and you were in Rochester, remember the protests in our city. At that point, they were labeled riots. They weren't riots. Those were folks who protested were just angry, and their anger and their hurt and grief just, erupted onto our streets. Many of us also remember the struggle over integration and busing in our schools all over the country. Many remember the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1968, which prohibited many discriminatory practices and strengthened the voting rights of Black people. Unfortunately, those rights are being eroded right now as we speak. This was welcomed by some and it frightened others for all kinds of reasons. So as we move ahead, we remember these names: Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Daniel Prude. That's only a list of 10 names of people of color that have died since 2012. There are many, many, many more names since 2012. There are many, many, many more names before 2012. But what has happened that I can read those names, and almost all of you will remember every one of those names and what happened. I think social media is one thing that has happened, and that in that way that it has been a gift. That pain and suffering and violence has risen up, so we know about it. We can hear about it if we choose to pay attention. So, I mean, that's one reason I think that I can read those names and you recognize those names and the pain and the meaning of the deaths of those people. And then we get to, then we say again, George Floyd, that was in the end of May, his terrible death. And then Daniel Prude, who was just a few weeks ago here in our own city, where we were told that kind of thing would never happen in our community. And yet it did. Shockingly to some of us, and especially to those people of color, it's not a shock. It's a shock, but it's not a shock at all. So these are names we know. Our recognition of these names is an indication that our consciousness is being raised about the possible consequences of being Black in our community. So work for racial equity is not new in Rochester. But the recent combination of violent death, Black deaths, and the highlight on COVID, and how COVID has disproportionately affected people of color, has brought awareness of the consequences of racism, both personal and structural, to a new level. And there, I'm speaking to us white people. Our awareness of what has happened and how serious it is and how absolutely disgraceful it is. So we have been shaken awake. If we go back to that question about can you wake up anymore? As Father Timon said, I work at St. Joseph's Neighborhood Center, which is a healthcare provider for those who do not have insurance or do not have proper access to healthcare that they need. And need not to just kind of stay on one level of health, but actually be healthy enough to thrive. About 60% of our patients and clients are people of color. So for over 25 years, we have had a ringside seat to racial disparities in healthcare. I'm not really digressing. I just want to illustrate something for you that I have come to know. I belong to a board that's connected with the University of Rochester, and it's connected with their Office of Human Subject Protection. Our board is called the IRB, or Institutional Review Board, and there are 5 boards. They have the responsibility, or the members of the boards have the responsibility of reviewing every new research study that starts at the university, and then doing a yearly, at least yearly review of those research studies as for their life. And some of them are over in a year or two. Some have been going on for like 15 years. The board is made up of academics from the U of R, medical professionals from the U of R, and then there's always at least 2 community members, and I fill one of those seats as a community member. My role as the community member on this review board is to look at all of the studies, and I got to tell you, there's a lot of science there. I don't know what the heck they're talking about. But what I do know and what I look at is I look at all of the stuff that will go to research participants, and that's mostly called an informed consent form. And it needs to state in accessible language to anybody who's going to participate in a research study what that means for them, what's going to be done to them, what kind of procedures they're going to undergo, how much blood is going to be taken, how often they have to go to visit, just what it means to be in this research study, so they can make an informed consent about whether they want to be a part of this. Now, I say all of this because in the last few years, I've probably been doing this for 8 to 10 years. So in the last few years, I'm reading these research reviews and then the informed consent. And often they'll have inclusion and exclusion criteria, and or they'll talk about what the subject or participant population should look like. And very often it says the subject or participant population will reflect the diversity in our city. So I started to make note of that phrase. And then what I found is when I continued on into the protocol, there were no methods, there was no intent, there was no program, there were no recruitment materials that actually they said they were going to go out into the community and actually recruit a diverse population into the study. So they said it. So I got more and more annoyed. So I am like the broken record at the review table and going, they said the participants are going to reflect the diversity in our community. They're not doing anything to ensure that. So they either do something to ensure that, or they take that phrase out of the study, because they're claiming something that is not true. Now, there's a background to this. Some of you will know that you heard about the Tuskegee, experiments years ago, where black men were injected with syphilis and then not treated and not told. And that, along with a lot of other stories, have soured the research pool for people of color to actually take part in these research studies, because the trust is not there. There is no trust at all about what's going to be done. That is actually proven had been proven out, because today we're looking at health disparities, and we have data that says Black people don't get the same care for their diseases as white people do. Therefore, now there are disparities in cardiac. People die earlier, Black people die earlier from cardiac disease or from diabetes or for any number of disease, because the research that has been done all on white people and not done on Black people or Hispanic people or any other group of people where the results of a test or a disease might be different for them. So that's just, I wanted to just say one experience to you that I have had and started to realize I can speak up about this. Now, Gary, you'll know this. Speaking up at the U of R might not get you anywhere real fast. But I just figure if I keep saying it over and over and over again, and then especially in our current climate of highlighting race and racism, I think maybe there's a foothold we can do in the research community about what it means to actually have a diverse population when you're doing when you're doing research, and not just lip service, but actually getting into your community and building trust back up. That takes a long time when deaths have occurred, actual deaths have occurred because of racist practices. So that's something I've been involved in for a long time, and it actually was a really good entree for me and for the Neighborhood Center to get involved in the work of race and racial equity. In 2015 and 2016, the center made a commitment to interrogate our own practices and procedures, to identify racism in our own system and eradicate it as we could. We invited 2 or 3 of our sister agencies to participate with us, and oh my, this is a good problem to have, but we were overwhelmed. When we were ready to launch, we had 28 agencies actually, and almost 200 people that wanted to participate, that wanted to commit resources and people and time to a 2-year interrogation of systemic racism. So we swallowed hard. We said to everybody, we don't know what the heck we're doing, but let's go on the road. Let's go on the road together. So our theory was simple, actually, that racism does not go away overnight. Racism does not go away after hearing one lecture or reading one book. Eradicating racism is transformational change in mind and heart and structures. It's person by person and structure by structure over a very long period of time, all of our lives, actually. If it took us 400 years to get here, it's going to take us at least 400 years to get out of it. We invited people to join us on that road, a road that, as we said to them, it would be a lifetime. After 2018, or in 2018, when we finished the formal program for the first cohort and gave them some help and how do you continue on the road, we already had another 20 agencies that wanted to be cohort 2. So we did that, and currently COVID delayed us a little bit. We're going to finish up cohort 2 in March, and we already have another 28 agencies or so that want to be part of cohort 3. So what does that say about the consciousness in our community? I think it says a lot. That there are that many agencies, there are that many people who are willing to make a commitment and actually hungry to make a commitment to dive into racism, the meaning of racism, uncover racial disparities and bias that that are a part of us. So we were heartened by that. We weren't heartened by the fact that we still didn't know what we were doing. And that we had also morphed. When we first started, we called it the Structural Racism Initiative. And then we merged with another group working on race called FREE. And we matured into what we call the Racial Equity and Justice Initiative, which has this really, really nifty acronym of REGI, R-E-J-I. So, and people in the community now, if you say REGI, they know what you're talking about, which is really quite a feat. As I said, the deaths of George Floyd and Daniel Prude certainly awakened for the country, and Daniel Prude certainly for us in our community, a deep desire in many to respond to what we're seeing and learning about the consequences of racism. Requests to REGI for resources, information, help, programs, definitive and meaningful action about racism increased many fold. It increased beyond the bandwidth of our staff and our resources. Again, it's a good thing that's happening in our community. It doesn't feel so good that we don't have the resources actually to respond to all of this desire for an increased consciousness. So right now we're looking at partnerships with other efforts on racism going on in the city. And I thank God that REGI is not the only actor in town. You know, there's a lot of work going on, some larger efforts and some very quiet efforts. Just to name a few for you, so that you kind of know what's going on in the community, I would say you know, you've designed a 3-part program that specifically is looking at the issue of race. You're not the only, you're good for you, and you're not the only ones doing this. You're not the only ones inviting people together to say, let's look clearly and transparently at this issue. And it's not just an issue, the more we look, it's like, it's people's lives. It's the lives of people that we know. And sometimes we've never bothered to learn what the pain of racism has meant in their lives. And now it's time to bother to know and to listen. Another effort besides these, you know, smaller and very important gatherings of people, the Center for Community Engagement at St. John Fisher College has for several years now incorporated into their curriculum for the community attention to diversity on boards of directors, whether they're not-for-profit or they're for-profit organizations. Realizing that there's been a call for years to diversify boards and get more representative again of our community in our organizations. I've heard for years from people to say it's just so hard. We just can't find people. And I finally came to the realization, well, you can't find people because you haven't broadened your circles and you haven't bothered to find out where to ask and where to look. So it's not our problem. It's not the problem of Black people or Latino people who would love to be on some of these boards. It's our problem. We haven't bothered to expand our universe and actually find out where we should be looking, who we should be connecting with, who we should be partnering with. So this is an attempt by the Center for Community Engagement to actually say, there's lots of resources out there for us to expand our boards of directors or whatever group it is, and get the voice of the community around tables that especially are making decisions and policy decisions. So that's one. Now, the city of Rochester accepted, I think about 2 years ago, they applied for and were accepted into a national program called REAL, that's Racial Equity and Leadership. And the commitment they had to make is that the work for racial equity and leadership infiltrates all departments of the city. So I just want to take a sidebar here and say, well, it really looks like our city is kind of in a mess. So what have they been doing for 2 years if they're supposed to be working on racial equity and leadership? And for our current cohort of Reggie, 17 departments of the city are participating in the Reggie information, including the police department. So it's a little conundrum for us. We're wondering what's going on in the police department, that they're taking seriously this commitment to the work of Reggie, and yet we have what's going on in our streets. And another sidebar is that Cynthia Harriet Sullivan, who was sworn into her new job as the interim chief of police, is on our board. And she's absolutely fabulous, wonderful woman who's been committed to the work of racism for her whole life. So we are sending prayers up daily for her and her success at this, and her forbearance for what is going to be a really, really hard job. So I want to raise up the city, because they are trying. They really are trying to look at issues, structural issues, especially in the city, and do what they can. And it's involved, as I said, 70 departments and probably 100 people that work within city government. There are several small groups in the city who have made a commitment to understanding racism and learning what it means to be anti-racist. Some groups working are all white. Some are all people of color. Some are diverse. Some are all women, and some are all men. It's every combination you can kind of think of. They meet regularly, weekly or monthly, to discuss their experience, read a book together, watch a video together, and just try to understand, meeting by meeting, what the meaning of race is, and then support each other in their discovery, in their work. You probably will never hear, unless you're part of one, you probably will never hear of these small groups of people who are getting together, like 8 to 10 people, so everybody can have a meaningful voice together, and really tackling this issue of racism, and not just racism, but how to be an anti-racist, which is action oriented. In fact, I just had an email today with someone who I know is started a small group of white men, and together they have launched several men's groups of men who are all white, and they keep it small in size so they can have good discussion with each other. And they create safe space to be able to talk about issues of race that may be uncomfortable. And then along with safe space, they create what we call brave space. Safe space is you can trust where you are. Brave space is you can trust these people enough that you can say uncomfortable things, and that all people in the group have made the commitment to stay in your chair and not escape from an uncomfortable conversation. Just stay there. And if it's just staying there and listening, especially as a white person, just stay there and stay in the discomfort. That's brave space. And it takes some work to create both safe and brave space for people. So they're able to be transparent with each other about what it means to be a white man, what biases they may hold, and how to change themselves and the circles that they move in. Really brave work, and again, it takes a long time. Another example is the Urban League in Rochester, which has been around for 100 million years, is sponsoring a major summit on race next week. Now, previous to this, a few months ago, they initiated a program called Interrupt Racism, and this is in a collaboration with Rochester Institute of Technology. So this Interrupt Racism is sponsoring a major summit on race next week, October 20th and 21st. It's all going to be virtual. It's all Zoom, but they've got wonderful local and national speakers and panels lined up for those 2 days of really, really informative, information for people. And I will just say that this is like, you're like one of the first ones to hear this, because we're still developing it. The Urban League has realized when they started Interrupt Racism that the programs they developed are quick and short-term responses to individuals and groups who want to get into the work of racism, want information, want what do I do now? What do I do now? They want a now response. What they realized is that they can respond. They've developed the resource to respond quickly and kind of short term, but they didn't have what Reggie had, which was the long-term approach to transformational change around racism. So at the end of this week, actually, we're going to get everybody together from the Urban League and from the Neighborhood Center and just say, you got this and you don't have that, and we got that, but we don't have this. And so can we create a merger or a partnership between the Urban League and the Neighborhood Center and Reggie, so that we have a whole continuum of response and resources around the area of racism? This is, and I'm excited about this because it's not one of us recreating the wheel. It's realizing we each have a resource that the other needs, and we're going to put those together for, we hope, for the greater good of the community. So you'll hear more, and we think that this is a really, really positive, partnership that we can build. The United Way has for years sponsored leadership development programs for Black people and for Latinx people. As I said, these have been going on for years. If someone is in the leadership development program, it's almost a year long with regular, at least monthly meetings to talk about the qualities of leadership, to orient people to the qualities of leadership, to learn about the community, to learn about this is what communities need you to offer, to our organizations, both for-profit and not-for-profit. And then they have these wonderful graduation ceremonies with those who have gone through the program. And this is a wonderful place. It's a wonderful program to dip into if groups are looking to recruit to their board or whatever other group that they're trying to put together. It's a wonderful resource. It's nowhere near used as widely as it could be and should be. I will say that the Neighborhood Center, over several years, at least since 2015, has developed what is now a really large web-based resource site that's right on the Neighborhood Center's website. It's specifically with information and material on racism. It includes things like personal and organizational assessments on race. So in some instances, organizations have taken an assessment and they've asked everybody in the organization. For instance, Catholic Family Center did this. Everybody in the organization to take this assessment and just to say honestly, where on the scale of racist to anti-racist, where do you think our organization falls? And then they take that information, they kind of note whether the response is coming from a person of color or a white person, which gives you an idea of different perspectives. And then they take that information, they've launched several programs, and then they'll do the assessment again maybe a year later, just to see if there's any metric or any measurement that has changed people's perception for good or for bad. There's also individual assessments. You can either find this through our website or go to the website for Harvard University, and they have an individual racism assessment that you can go through and take. And it's really interesting and it's very sobering to go through that. And it gives you a lot of information about yourself. Some biases we may know we have, and some that are hidden that we would never have guessed about ourselves. There are all kinds of books on race and videos and presentations and more. So I would just say it's www.sjncenter, which is St. Joseph's Neighborhood Center, .org. I'm really, I get in a little chat that we're near the end, and so am I. So I'm just gonna end there. And John, if we've got questions in the chat, that's fine. We'll just proceed with whatever way you're gonna proceed.
Great. Thank you so much. There are a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe one that came through from Carol resonated with something that I wanted to ask you, so maybe I'll try to wrap them together. I think we all are aware that there are many Christian communities, including white Catholics, who overwhelmingly support Donald Trump, and I think we all here recognize that you can't be anti-racist and support Donald Trump, and you also can't be anti-racist and and you can't not be anti-racist and be a Christian. And so I wanted to ask you what you think the most powerful argument is to use our faith to convince those that share our faith that that we need to take this, that those things are true, that you can't be a Christian without being anti-racist, and you need to take that seriously when you think about how you vote.
Yeah, that's a great and complicated question, John. It's complicated. On the other hand, it could be answered very, very simply. There are so many things in our Christian tradition, in scriptures, and even looking at lives of the saints, or everything in our tradition, which point to the teaching of the gospel that everyone is part of the same body, and everyone is to be respected. Everyone is afforded the dignity that they need, and racism flies in the face of anything that separates us from each other. I know, and sometimes I think there's just, there's some folks, Christian or not, who are so believing in anything that our president says that there's no persuasion, to be done. And I think what we can say is, I'm speaking my truth. I'm speaking my truth to you. I'm hoping we could have a good dialogue here with some permeable boundaries between us, so some of our words can be, shared and accepted, and we can come to some kind of understanding. So that's complicated. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of guts, and it takes a lot of sitting in uncomfortable chairs or in comfortable situations and continuing with respect, to listen to each other. So that's kind of the more complicated response. My more simple response is, it doesn't matter who's president. It doesn't matter what laws are passed. It doesn't matter what party it is. Because we're not talking about politics here. We're not talking about presidents. We're not talking about, those who are in power or not in power. We're talking about lives. And so when we hang our ability to look at racism or examine ourselves about racism or being anti-racist, when we hang that on politics or some kind of false dedication to, some idea, and we don't actually say, no, this is about lives. This is about respect. It doesn't matter who the president is. Do what's the right thing. So, it's kind of a complicated answer, and that's more, we like to be persuasive, especially in areas of respect for human life, all human life. And that takes time, and it takes a lot of dialogue. On the other hand, there's the right thing to do. And that comes to us as individuals and as Christian communities, that we do the right thing, no matter who's telling us what or who's acting in what, in what way. I think that probably was a very unsatisfactory answer, but that's where I am right now, and it's like you just got to do what your heart tells you to do, and what our Christian, and we have a very multi faith, interdenominational staff and volunteers here. And I got to say, across the board, it doesn't matter whether it's Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or none. We seem to be coming to a common understanding of what the right thing is to do, and it seems to always be the same thing of what to do.
Thank you. John McDermott, you had a series of questions you had submitted. Would you like to just ask them or ask one or two of them? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thanks, John. I had a whole series of questions that arose. It's great to hear about all the low-level stuff that's happening in different organizations and the raising of consciousness, which of course is extremely important. But last week, we heard from Reverend Judy Davis, and I'm delighted to see Judy with us tonight and joining us. And she said she's pretty much given up on, if I can quote you, I don't know if I got it right, but I thought I heard you say that you've pretty much given up on changing hearts and minds. It's about access to power and making structural changes in policies and that sort of stuff. Do you see, so let me ask you, do you get any sense by local politicians or other leaders of is there any collaboration taking place between the city and the county at this point, or the suburbs and the city? Or is there any sense by local politicians or other leaders of what are the most important changes that should be taking place in Rochester to mitigate racial injustice? Is it changes in policing practices, structural change in school districting, changing over employment and hiring practices in the police and the teachers union, or is it something else? What do you see happening at that level, and in terms of the power structures themselves and local changes that have to be made to structural racism in our community?
Yeah.
Long-winded question.
And my answer is not going to be heartening. I would tend to agree with Judith. I unfortunately I didn't hear your presentation last week, but I would agree with you. Because to answer your question about what's happening on a larger level, politically or systemically, I would say there's still very much at the level of just talk. What we are kind of what we call our theory of change at Reggie is, while it's about structural change, we say to people, because it's organizations who have signed up to work with Reggie, and that necessarily is about institutions and structures. And what we say and we give information and we have help with is there are at least 4 levels of transformational change. It's personal, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. And we as individuals have got to be working, especially on the individual and interpersonal, at the same time that we're working on the institutional and structural. So that Reggie's work is to take an organization and say, structurally, look at your policies, look at your employment practices, look at your hiring practices, look at your recruiting practices, look at the power structure in your organization, look at the power differential, look at the makeup of your staff, and of your staff, who's in upper levels and who's in mid levels and who's in lower levels. And dismayingly, there's a color differential in those. So our goal is to say to people, the institutional and structural isn't going to happen if you're not at the same time looking inside yourself. Otherwise, it's just surface change. But you have to look organizational. You have to look at these things, because those racist structures are embedded and have been embedded for years. And if we don't interrogate them, they are not going to change. I will just, again, I'm going to use Catholic Family Center as an example. They've done a fabulous job in employing all of the tools that have been given to them. They have absolutely restructured their recruiting and hiring practices. For instance, they leave names off of resumes so that there can be no implicit bias just by a name, that when you're looking at a resume, it's just the resume. That's a huge change for a big organization. Another organization that is doing structural change, and this was a huge surprise to them, one of our cohort 2 groups is the Monroe County Library System. And what they discovered, is historically is the Dewey Decimal System is a racist classification system. And so they are taking on the huge task of reorganizing the classification system that we use in our libraries to rid it of its racist roots. Books were categorized according to race. Books by and about Black people or people of color were relegated even to not be in the library or be off someplace that didn't make any sense. So this was absolutely astounding news to them, and they took it seriously, and they said, we're going to take on the Dewey Decimal System and that classification system and see what we can do to eradicate racism there. So I have to say to you, John, I think like the Raise Commission that came up after George Floyd's death with the county and the city, they're just talking. They're just talking. They're not doing anything. But there are pockets of real structural change that are happening. It's just, I don't think it's happening on a governmental level.
Chris, do you see anything happening with our MAPI? Is it making any progress? And for those of you who may not be familiar with it, it was the effort initiated 5 years ago, Rochester, Monroe area poverty initiative, anti-poverty initiative. And racism and poverty are so embedded with each other.
Yeah. Actually, work on racism is one of the 3 pillars of our MAPI, structural racism. The neighborhood center, after we finished our first initiative, our MAPI approached us and said, you're doing the work that we said we would do. Would you be the backbone organization for that pillar of our MAPI to promote, the work on racism in the Rochester community? And we said yes. We said yes to that. So we are one of the backbone organizations for our MAPI. 4 months ago, our MAPI got a new executive director, and she's dynamic, and I think she's done more in the last 4 months than have been done in the last 4 years with our MAPI. So I have some hope. I was losing all hope about our MAPI, to be frank, John. But now with this new leader, and we continue to be part of our MAPI, and we will, now that we kind of see some new life or some new direction. I really can't speak to the other 2 pillars, which are employment and I forget what the third one is, because we're not working in that in that sector. But in terms of these structural racism piece, we're trying to be the backbone on that for our MAPI, and we'll see where it goes. Now, our funding through our MAPI is ending in March, so there's that thing too. There's the money to do the work. Needs to be raised. But I actually, John, this about me. I never worry about money. We never worry about money at the neighborhood center. Somehow, we're 80% funded by private donations, and somehow it all works every year. So I just don't start with money. But it is, I know it's a reality that we have to face. So that's kind of the answer for our MAPI. I see maybe some new life being, new breath coming into the RMAPI arena. So.
Thank you so much. I think we have time maybe for one more question or comment, if there is one. You can feel free to just jump in, unmute yourself.
Carolyn, you got to unmute yourself.
I wondered if my really, really good friend and colleague, who is Black and who is an associate of Sisters of St. Joseph.
You mean Terry?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. You said we're all white, and immediately my mind flashed to her.
Yeah, and she's such a good friend of the congregation, and I consider her a really, really good friend. She and I often sit down when we could see each other at the Mother House. We would often sit down, and some ludicrous, absolutely unbelievably racist thing had happened, and we would just sit there and giggle and going, "Can you believe that?" But she's a forbearing, patient, beautiful woman, and we are forever blessed that she has, made a connection with the Sisters of St. Joseph, to be a part of us. We lay claim to the fact that our sisters were in Selma on Bloody Sunday, have been there for decades. And we're the sisters who staffed St. Elizabeth Hospital, which is the only place that people who were beaten, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge could go. It's the only place that they would be cared for. And one of those people was John Lewis, and he forever has been a wonderful friend of the congregation. And he will say all the time, "You saved my life. You saved my life." He had been struck in the head. He had a concussion. It's the only place he could get care. So there's a history of us working with people of color, and that's just fine. But I think the congregation, just like the rest of the world, needs to interrogate its own history of why is it that Terry Watson is the only woman of color that ever entered the Sisters of St. Joseph. And we have a very, very tough question to look, to examine and look at for ourselves. So thank you for bringing her up. She's a wonderful role model, a wonderful friend. So.
Thank you so much. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to Father Gary for closing prayer.
The closing prayer that I have comes from Pope Francis. It is at the end of his new encyclical letter, Fratelli Tutti, on the fraternity and social friendship. And his prayer: Lord, Father of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts a fraternal spirit, and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen.
Thank you all so much for joining us, and especially to Sister Chris for this wonderful presentation.
Yes, thank you, Chris.
And please, to all of our attendees, please do look out for an announcement. You'll receive an email invitation for our concluding session next week. So thank you again, and good night.